Users of Reddit. What's a dark family secret you've uncovered? I found out one of my aunts had an arranged marriage. She wasn't the one who was supposed to be in the arranged marriage, but her sister was adamant against marrying the dude, and I guess my grandma decided to persuade my aunt into replacing the sister's part of the marriage. Aunt and the dude got married and moved away, and had kids. They lived far away, so I barely ever saw them, but only as I got older did I learn that the dude was abusive to my aunt, to the point where she still had some intense mental breakdowns long after he died. My grandpa doesn't know that his dad was hit and killed by a drunk driver. He was like 2 when his dad died and can't remember any of it. The only thing he said was that he thought it involved a truck. I found the article of my great-grandfather's death when I started digging into my grandpa's family tree. I also found that great-grandpa was the result of a teen pregnancy and was raised by his grandparents. I'd tell him, but I'm not really sure there's too much point in bringing it up now. My dad tried to run out on my mom while she was pregnant with me, because he'd been embezzling money from a photography club at his workplace, then a government institution, where he'd been treasurer. It was all about to come out because the club needed the money, so my dad decided to cut and run. My mother's brother and father caught him by pure accident as he was leaving the house, and my granddad, a burly Scots coal miner, got him by the throat and told him if he ever pulled a stunt like that again he'd be dead. My dad, according to the story, would himself right there. My granddad paid the money back to the club so that no one found out, as not only would my dad have lost his job, he'd most likely have been jailed too. My mom though could never trust him with money again, and so although they had a joint bank account, she had them limit his access and made a separate account to control the bills etc. as she went back to work so she could always support herself, which in those days in rural Scotland was really uncommon. In that area, most women were stay-at-home moms. So, there was no such thing as childcare for under 4s. Mom went back to her job as a primary school teacher, and I spent the first few years of my life sleeping in a basket in the stationery cupboard in her classroom. At Mom's funeral, some of her former colleagues were still coming up to me, saying, "Oh, it's the baby in the cupboard." Uncle Joseph is very probably a serial killer, a major suspect for the West Mesa bone collector. He is also convicted as the middle school rapist. One day Joseph was just sort of out of the picture and no concrete answer was given why. At the time I was young enough that I didn't think to push or particularly wonder at the details. My 11-year-old cousin got pregnant, then was in Dr. Phil's trash TV show. Her aunt adopted the baby, and 12-ish years later they haven't told her any of this. She's seen pics of her mom from when she was a kid and said she doesn't remember taking that picture. They look identical. When I was a kid I knew my grandfather was odd. He'd call me his grandson even when I was wearing a dress and clearly female, but my parents would tell me to ignore it. Then I found out that when my dad was a kid, Grandpa sold my dad's sister Barbara to someone and kept my dad and his brother because he didn't want a girl in the family. My dad found his sister Barbara around the time I was in middle school via calling around to get records. They were reunited. She's my favorite aunt now. No one like Grandpa, not nearly as bad, but I never met my grandfather even though he didn't die until I was around 10 and he only lived an hour away. He didn't get along with my dad. Drunkenly beating up your kid may result in isolation, but he refused to acknowledge me or my sister, because he was so pissed that there was no one to carry on the family name as my dad was his only son. When my youngest brother was born, he reached out to my father for the first time in 10 years to congratulate him. He also disowned my 2 aunts because they moved out and went to college. The younger aunt once described to me the dread she felt telling him that she'd been accepted to college, knowing she'd be summarily kicked out just as her sister was. However, he reconciled with her later in life because she had 2 sons and no daughters. Anyway, joke's on him. My sister and I are far more healthy and successful than my male cousins that he considered worthy of his love and attention. I can think of 2 off the top of my head. I'm sure there are more I'll think of. My dad's family was messed up. Secret 1. The disabled kid. My dad was pretty open about it, but I know they kept it hush-hush within their community. I cowed when my dad found out, but he discovered he had an older brother, his parents' oldest child Ron, if I remember right, named after his dad. When Ron was preschool age they were told he was mentally retarded. Horrified, they turned him over to the state and never spoke of him again. Years later word got back to them that the kid was not in fact mentally disabled. He had auditory dyslexia, now called auditory processing disorder. He grew up to be a fully functioning independent adult. He refused to have any contact with the family when my dad reached out. Totally fair emo. Secret 2. Pedophile, the previously mentioned Ron Sr., who disowned Ron Jr., was a child rapist. When they were grown, my dad and his younger brother learned that their father had raped their sister on multiple occasions and threatened her to keep her quiet. She didn't tell anyone until long after it all happened. Later she reconnected with her father and allowed him to meet and spend time with her children. Edit, almost forgot. They found out after their mom died that apparently the youngest brother had a different father than the other 3 kids. I'd give they ever discovered the story behind that one. Before my granddad committed suicide, he was planning to kill every single family member in the house. Grandmom, my aunt, 2 uncles, few more people. Edit with more details. He had left a detailed suicide note blaming everyone for his death and his intention to kill all. Family speculation is that it was due to some extramarital affair he had, and how the family was obstructing his path. My mom's family is still traumatized by this entire episode and no one likes to talk about it. I guess that trauma of waking up one day and learning that your dad, who just committed suicide, was also planning to kill all of you, is impossible to shake off in a lifetime. My great aunt and uncle had a baby when they were still in the dating phase. They were in love and getting married was a sure thing down the line. However, coming from a very conservative society in the Middle East back in the 50s, they had to give the child away to an orphanage. Once that was done, they got married and eventually had 4 children. That child grew up knowing his origins and only allowed minimal contact with his family. He still isn't invited to family events and has a family of his own. When my great-uncle passed away, I was told he was amongst the randoms that came to the cemetery to pay respects. None of my cousins, including myself, know what he looks like, but my dad and his siblings and cousins all do. It's sad how he's punished for something that isn't his fault. My great-aunt was a nurse at a mental hospital about 100 years ago. She fell in love with a guy who had been committed there by the state. She helped him escape and they ran off together to another part of the country. Turns out the guy was a psycho murderer and he got extradited back and put in prison. My aunt, a sweet old soul, lived to be 99 years old, and I never knew anything about her past until decades after she was gone. My one cool uncle came to our house every Christmas. Thanksgiving was always really great and pleasant. Had a bunch of cats and dogs at his house. Was married to my aunt shortly before I was born. So one day my mom and I went to visit him and my aunt at his house, and there's this girl there. I think she was a year older than me, so about 15. My mom and I are like, "Who's this girl?" And my uncle is like, "Well, I just found out a few days ago that I have a daughter, so I guess this is your cousin." Turns out that before my uncle and aunt got married, my uncle had a pretty wild bachelor party in which a prostitute was hired. One thing led to another, and my cousin appears 15 years later to find her father. She was so sweet, and my uncle was actually really good about the whole situation. He even started paying child support to my cousin's mom, his idea. My aunt was also very forgiving. I've never met my cousin's mom. My grandfather tried to kill my dad with an axe. Literally showed up to his place of work and went looking to cut him down. And somehow, my unprepared dad fought him off barehanded. So Grandpa escaped and came back the next day to finish the job with a gun, but my dad didn't show up to work, so dude offed himself in the parking lot, leaving the bitchiest suicide note ever. I've told the story a lot of times here, but I still can't completely grasp that it and the circus of other shit that surrounded it were real. What was your grandpa's reasoning for wanting your dad dead? Did anyone find out? It's a long story. To try not to go crazy here. Grandpa beat him and his brothers and his mom. Alcoholic for sure, but probably mental problems too. They are in family, yay. Anyways, my dad had enough of it and worked a ton of jobs and moved them out of the house in the middle of the night. New life kinda relocation thing. So he was pretty pissed my dad ruined his life by I guess standing up for himself. Eventually the dude tracked down where my dad worked and went to end him. Far as people finding out, I'm pretty sure his brothers and mom knew. I don't know how many other family did. I only found out from my mom when I was like moving away to university, and I have no idea why she told me. I thought it was bullshit, but eventually he confirmed it. It sort of filled in a lot of gaps in his character. Does it count if it was a secret about me that everyone was keeping from me? I very recently learned that for the last 13 years or so, my entire family, extended, knew about me being raped in my early teens. Only problem is, I was never raped. It was all a figment of my mother's imagination, based on one comment I made, and she told everyone in my extended family that I had been raped but not to ask me about it because I was so traumatized. 13 years later, I am drunk with my sisters and I bring up this gyno study I was part of through my early teens, and my sisters both go, "Oh, thank God you finally said something. We've been top-toeing around this whole rape thing for over a decade." Imagine the look on my face, finding out that my entire family thought I had been raped, but A, never bothered to ask, and B, never did anything about it. I had to very gently tell my sisters that I had not been raped and they had been walking on eggshells around me for more than a decade for no reason. My uncle got his HS girlfriend pregnant and my grandmother drove her to the clinic for an abortion, agreeing to pay only if the GF didn't tell my uncle that she was going to abort his unborn child. It tore him up when he found out, but that hardly excuses his next actions. My mother gets pregnant by my father around this time and is not to discreetly offer the same deal, which my mother refuses with a few choice words. My uncle finds out, tracks my mother down, and punches her in the stomach for daring to take what was ripped away from him. My mother subsequently miscarried who would have been my big brother. My mom, the saint she is, forgave him and tried to help him get some therapy. He rejected her help and joined the army instead. I didn't find out any of this until I was an adult, which really ducked with my head since my uncle had always been really close to me up until I came out of the closet. He somehow thought of me as the daughter his mother had aborted. My uncle had a bastard child. When this child grew up, they discovered my grandfather and would call multiple times a month with some sob story for money. Being the absolutely kind-hearted, yet unbelievably gullible man he was, my grandfather gave in almost every time. One year my uncle dropped off the map. Couldn't call him, no one where he was. His family genuinely thought the worst. Well, the kid calls saying he's dead and wants their inheritance, as well as whatever inheritance he would have gotten from my grandparents' will. This drove the family absolutely mad with grief and rage. Eventually the kid even started threatening to get a lawyer for their due. Uncle showed up one day, turned out he ran out of money and got in trouble with some banks, so started hopping between towns. Kid dropped the lawsuit, and no one in my family let their kids talk to that cousin. I only ever met them at my grandfather's funeral. Oh boy, here we go. My family could have been worth millions. My grandpa's father, my great-grandfather, had built a company from the ground up called Johnson Corrugated. We made corrugated cardboard for shipping boxes. Great-grandfather was a major dick but had built the family empire, so we still see him in a good way. My grandfather was supposed to inherit the company 30-something years ago until Uncle Randy happened. My great-grandmother was still alive and was technically owner of the company. She was also blind and deaf. Uncle Randy comes in impersonating my grandfather and has her sign away the entire company over to him. He gives half of the $15 million to his son, who flees to Europe after the death threats. Randy dies within the month after fleeing the family from cancer. Nobody went to his funeral and we piss on his grave. Note, my grandpa is 80 and can't retire because he's been fighting this in court for the past 20 years and owes about $300,000 in legal fees. Fuck Randy. I found this out after stumbling into a stack of legal documents in my grandpa's attic. We still don't know where Randy's son is to this day. I was always told that my dad left me when I was born, and technically it's still true, but I was told my dad was someone completely different. I got a little suspicious about the whole thing because my cousin, who apparently didn't know the whole cover story, told me that my dad had blonde hair and my mother had black, and that's where I get my black hair, but everyone else told me my dad had black hair. I thought about it and had a little suspicious thoughts about the whole thing, and then what really revealed it to me was I had to use my birth certificate so I could join the military, and the name of my father said Alexander Smith and my last name is Smith, but they all told me that I got my name from a baby book, so that's why my last name was different from everyone else in my family. I then spent a couple days doing research on Alexander Smith and found out that everything added up. He was born in Russia and changed his name when he got here, and I'm 70% Russian, so that makes a lot more sense with that, and what sold it for me is that it said his mother's name was Natasha Kelevich, which was my grandmother's name. I confronted my family about it and they revealed that yes, he is my dad, and they told me what happened. To put it short, after I was born he didn't want any kids, so he tries to smother me in my sleep when I was just a little child. When he was stopped by my brother and my uncle, he left and they called the police on him. He later returned in the middle of the night and set fire to our house and killed our family dog, and the fire jumped to another house and killed an old lady in the process. After that he was arrested and sent to prison for life. He later died in prison. They said they wanted to keep it a secret, so I didn't know my dad was a psychopath murderer who wanted to try and kill me. They were planning on telling me over letter when I joined the military, but I figured that out beforehand. My mother probably went abroad to have an abortion. When I was 3 years old, Mom and her mother took a month-long vacation together. That was the only trip the two of them ever took just by themselves. It was also the only time my grandmother took a vacation without her husband. Dad's parents looked after me in the meantime. The day Mom returned, she handed me a pair of maracas. She and her mother told everyone they had been to Spain, but they didn't bring back any pictures or tell any stories about it. By contrast, Grandma was full of snapshots and anecdotes about her other travels. When I was around 8 years old and asked Mom about Spain, she quoted old movies. Right out of My Fair Lady, she answered the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plane. She never showed me a passport stamp. For all I know, she never even had a passport. When I was in college, Mom claimed she had never traveled overseas. There's that month in Spain, I replied. She fell silent. Apparently she had been hoping I'd forgotten. There had been other hints that something was off. During childhood, she tried to donate the maracas to charity a couple of times. I insisted on keeping them. They disappeared when I was 10 or 11. Shortly before they vanished, she saw me playing with them. She told me they weren't really maracas. This started an exchange where I asked her what the correct term was and why she had always called them maracas until then. She gave a couple of evasive responses before falling silent. None of this added up until decades later, when I realized her trip to Spain took place shortly before abortion was legalized where we were living, and that something like 30% of women in the United States have had an abortion. Best guess is that she and her mother either drove to Canada or flew to the UK and spent the month shuttling between medical clinics in a hotel room. Mom, Dad, and I had been living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time. Mom and Grandma probably decided she couldn't afford a second child. Dad never guessed a thing. Incidentally, my mother is a lifelong Republican who's also adamantly pro-choice. Edit. Mom never had substance abuse problems and her marriage was going well. Mental health treatment doesn't seem likely either. Although she and Dad were on a tight budget, a month-long trip was no stretch for her mother. Her parents were country club people. There were physicians who performed abortions illegally in the US at the time. Finding out about one through word of mouth might a while, plus transit. Alternatively, it isn't difficult to imagine her getting the operation and then spending a few weeks visiting museums and sites in Montreal. Her second language is French and she's that sort of person. She's never been a reliable narrator and her mother long since passed away. The big tip-off is her adamant support of abortion rights. It's neither her political leaning nor her personal temperament to take abstract stands in favor of rights, but she'll champion issues she knows firsthand. I was the family secret. My biological parents started having kids as teenagers. For context, when my biological mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was 21 and I was their fourth child. They quickly realized they needed to get their act together. They were already struggling financially, had countless drug issues, etc. They decided that they were going to put me up for adoption. I was a baby. I was adopted by a loving family quite quickly, only about an hour drive from the city I was born in. Coincidentally, I ended up returning to that same city for college. My sophomore year, I decided to seek out my biological family. Turns out, my biological parents separated right after I was born. My biological mom is still in and out of jail to this day, but my biological dad was able to start a new chapter. He got clean and sober, remarried, started going to church, and built a legitimate career for himself. He told his new wife about me when they first met, but didn't tell any of his children. My other siblings didn't know I existed. Thanks to the internet, I ended up tracking down his work number and gave him a call. Later on, he said as soon as I said, "Hi, this might be really weird," but he knew it was me. Apparently, ever since I turned 18, him and his wife were waiting anxiously for me to resurface. They knew the day would come eventually. That evening, they sat my siblings down and told them about me. It was difficult at first, but now I'm 25 and me and him have a pretty solid relationship.